So, St. Paul writing to Philippi, this is what's left of Philippi. Not a great deal. Used to be big, used to be nice, used to be a tourist spot. Well, actually, there might still be tourists going there. But anyway, it is there. You can visit it. It's now in Turkey. That's not very important. But it's not too far from where Paul himself was from, Tarsus. That also is just beside the point. So, a bit of background to him. Saul of Tarsus, starts off as a Pharisee, as you know. We are accustomed to thinking of the Pharisees as the ones who are challenging Jesus and who are against Jesus. But the Pharisees were people like you and me who were trying to live by the law and to fulfill the law as best they could. They were good, sincere and well-intentioned people, and St. Saul was one of them as well. So anytime you see Pharisee, you have to step back from the usual kind of dialectic that we see in the New Testament that places the Pharisees somehow in opposition to Jesus. Because of circumstances we can see that, but we must also hold in our minds that the Pharisees are actually the good guys. They're the good guys. They're the guys that should naturally be on Jesus' side because they believed in the Spirit and they believed in the resurrection from the dead. And they were people who were endeavouring to fulfill the law. Whereas the Sadducees, who are distinct from them, they are certainly distinct from us because they didn't believe in life after death and many other differences that we had. So the Pharisees are the natural allies of Jesus, and Saul happens to come from that. Having said that, he persecutes Christianity for many years bitterly. He persecutes them to death and is proud of that for a time. We know about that because he was there when Stephen was put to death and they put their clothes at his feet. And he tells us, or Luke tells us, but it's probably Paul speaking, that he entirely approved of the killing. So Saul has a lot to regret when he becomes a Christian, and that's what makes his conversion all the more striking when it comes. Saul and Hellenism, well, he is very familiar with Hellenism. His Greek is good. Obviously he's being helped in writing that down. But Hellenism is not just something that's not unfamiliar to him. He is very familiar with it. He is growing up in the Greek world, and he brings a brilliant mind to an understanding of that. I don't know if you've read anything by Jonathan Sacks, who was, until he's lately died not so long ago there. He was the chief rabbi in the UK, Lord Jonathan Sacks. And he started off as a student of Plato and Aristotle. I think it was in Oxford, is that right? And brilliant, and a good and a wise man. And having done all that at the highest level in the UK, he becomes a rabbi. But he's got both of those things going on in the same time here and here. And his writings, his books, I can highly recommend. Certainly to people writing homilies. They are brilliant. There is a lovely wisdom that we recognise as Christians because we too are the heirs to the great philosophers of the ancient world. And it ripples through everything that we think and say and do. And that's true for St. Paul as well. Paul's conversation? No, I think I meant conversion. I'm just noticing that now. I should have seen that when I was looking at it again at lunchtime. But his conversion and the revelation to him, we don't know much about the revelation to him, but he does mention it from time to time, and it clearly was an earthquake of some kind, and it seems to have gone on over a period or a number of occasions. It's difficult to say precisely what, but he appeals to that over the heads of even people like Peter and James, whom he confronts to their faces famously, because he is convinced that he has a message that comes from the living Lord himself, and that makes him an apostle just like them. It's an extraordinary claim, but it's a claim that the leaders of the church in Jerusalem accept and embrace, and it changes the world. It makes Christianity possible for people like you and me, the Gentile world that's out there. His conversion is one of the most momentous things in human history. It is difficult to overestimate, to overstate the importance of what happens on the road to Damascus. But we can take a wee look at that in a moment, if you wish. Paul in the early Christian tradition, even the word tradition, even the idea of him taking what was given to him and passing it down as faithfully as he possibly can, that's something that we have in St. Paul, and we see it in a couple of different places. And that helps us to be good Catholics, because one of the things that is so important to us is as a lodestar, as a guide, a permanent guide before us, is to try and be as faithful as possible to what has been given to us, that we then pass down to the next generation. And that's what traditio is, that's what tradition means. Paradosis, it's the passing down of something precious from one generation to another, and it becomes a living link back up the way through all the people who came before us, to St. Paul, to St. Peter, to those who knew and loved the Lord in this life, the living Lord. And it's our chain, it's our golden thread, it's our silken thread that ties us to the living Lord, to be faithful to tradition. So whenever you hear people using the word tradition with a shrug of the shoulders and a kind of roll of the eyes, oh, tradition, it's just tradition. No, nothing is just tradition in the Catholic Church. The tradition is alive and well and keeps us in touch with Jesus Christ, our living Lord. And we get that from St. Paul. Okay, Paul's apostolic experience. Well, Paul's apostolic experience is pretty impressive. Paul's apostolic experience got him all over the Mediterranean a number of times, and there's maybe even bits that we're not sure about, we don't know, or there are nice exotic traditions. I saw a thing on a website today when I was looking for a map, this map, and it said, yeah, maybe even he got to Britain. Really? Britain? Okay, I don't know. I like the idea. The one that I thought was the most eccentric one is that you might have got to Spain. You'll have heard that one, perhaps. I don't know if someone said that earlier, but Britain. London. I'd never seen that before. Hey ho, these are his journeys, and boy did he get around, as you can see, including Malta, but up to Rome, and he finishes in Rome. I'm not going to belabor this, but this is just, all those squiggles are just to give you an idea of how he got around. It tells you about how safe it was in the Roman Empire to move around. You could be a tourist if you had the money. Okay. Although on his last journey he wasn't being a tourist. I think he had 10 soldiers to make sure he didn't run away. But all of this is him moving around, and this, which is mostly the Greek-speaking world here, he knew it, and he was from there, and he travelled among it amply, and got to preach the gospel there. There's Philippi up there in Macedonia, okay, that we're going to get into shortly. But that's just to give you an idea of how impressive the guy was, the air miles this guy put in. So his big picture thinking, Paul's gospel, Jesus is the Son of God. Now, we use the word gospel the way that he uses the word gospel. So there's Evangelion is gospel, and sure it means the four gospels. But the way that we talk about the gospel as the good news in a general sort of way is something we get from Paul. Paul says it all the time, and you and I take it for granted, we don't even notice, but we get that from St. Paul. His gospel, I put this deliberately, Paul's gospel is Jesus the Son of God. I love this, you'll have heard me say this before. I love the drama of Damascus. We don't quite know what happened on the road to Damascus, but he goes into the synagogue and the authorities are saying, right, well, that's Saul here, we're going to clear this town. of all these rascally Christians. He's got letters. He's going to be able to take away men, women and children. They're going to be dragged off in chains. They'll be put to death. That'll set an example, and that'll be the end of this Christian nonsense. And what happens instead is he goes in and he says, Jesus is the Son of God, and there is uproar, absolute uproar, because this is the opposite of what he was supposed to do. And something has changed in his life, in his mind, on the road to Damascus. As you know, of course, that has become something that we say all the time, and we understand what it means when we say that. But for Paul himself personally, something radical changed, and I think it must have been growing. In my experience of these things, I don't think these things actually do fall out of the sky and hit you in the head and your life has changed. That doesn't happen. It happens. Maybe it's happened to you. But I have also noticed how often it happens that people change their minds without realizing it, and then all of a sudden they have a moment and they can't go back. And I wonder if that's what happened to St. Paul, that it was growing in his mind, that there was a dissonance in what he was doing. And I wonder if it was also through the example of those that he had chained up and put before the authorities, and who were being persecuted, as far as we can tell, fairly bitterly. And this must have got to him. I think this must have got into his soul, so that he is able to go to Damascus, and against all expectations, he says simply, Jesus is the Son of God. And those few words contain everything that he is going to unpack for the rest of his life, in his letters and in his preaching. Christ's role, where are we? The Father's plan of salvation history. Again, this is something that we take for granted, but we find marbled again and again through Paul's thinking. It's also the start of Trinitarian thinking, although the word Trinitas is not going to appear for a long time till we have Tertullian. But by the end of the first century, it is clear that Christians are already talking about a God that is 3 in 1 and 1 in 3, although they haven't quite got the language for that yet. And we can see that especially in St. John, but we can see it elsewhere too, and we can see it in St. Paul pretty clearly. And Christ's role in salvation history, but I'm going to go on to that in a little bit more detail. So, Jesus in Paul's writing, well, that the Son was pre-existent. This is something we see in St. John. We see it in the idea of the Logos, which is something that comes from Greek thinking. But that the Son pre-existed, in other words, there was a divine element to him, where he came from, that he wasn't just a nice young rabbi that was put to death. There is more to Jesus, and St. Paul helps to unpack that. He uses the term kurios, Lord, which is just a nice way of saying sir, but it also means Lord, the way that we use Lord. It also means, in this context, it means the risen Lord. And that's what we often expect to see, or hidden behind it, or also included in using that term. And we're going to see more of that in this text tonight. Kurios, very important word. And the idea of Jesus' passion and death and resurrection being a unit, being something that hangs together, and that was intended for all time, for all eternity by the Father. Again, we see it in St. Paul. We totally take it for granted, but Paul is the place where this starts to be knitted together into a thesis. And the relationship between the Lord and the Spirit. So again, emerging ideas of Father and Son and Holy Spirit. And although I think maybe St. Luke is someone that talks about the Holy Spirit a little bit more, the Spirit is still important. I think we're going to see a little bit of that in the text in front of you as well soon. So what happens when we're saved? Well, this is interesting too. Again, see all that? That's all pretty normal. We're all pretty used to thinking about these things, like we're reconciled with God, yes. Our sins are expiated for by the Lord dying on the cross. that it's a freeing, we're liberated, it's redemption, and that we are justified. That's a very, very Pauline word, and there was a great deal of fighting about that at the Reformation. And our thinking about that, Catholic and Protestant, is coming together a little bit better these days. But a lot of the medieval controversy was something that Paul wasn't even thinking about. He wasn't really thinking about it at all. And both sides of the Reformation have had to get past that in order to get to a fresh understanding of justification. But justification through faith, the story of Abraham being justified by his faith. Our language continues to struggle to get it right, and that includes with our Protestant brothers and sisters. We're still feeling our way forward into this, and I enjoy, although I'm not always sure I agree with a number of Protestant authors on this subject, but it's getting interesting again. I think we're getting close to a synthesis, but I'm not an expert in this stuff. I'm just saying this as a Catholic, okay? That we're getting there, and I don't think we're quite there yet. But justification, how we are justified by Christ's death on the cross, how we are justified by our faith, is something that he says in a number of important places. And here we are 2,000 years later, still trying to establish clearly what we mean by that, and to see if there can be a consensus since the Reformation. Okay. So Paul's anthropology, this is another thing. So anthropology, this is you and me, anthropoi. The anthropos, you and I, we usually say man, but anthropos isn't man. Aner is man, meaning a man. But anthropos is all of us, each one of us, you and I, as we stand before Christ. So the relationship that we have as people, as human beings to God, is something that concerns him. Sin, what's sin all about? Where does it come from? What is the meaning of it? The struggle between the law and the Spirit, we see this again and again, because as a Pharisee, he's someone who put a great deal of faith in the law, and realised one day that the law was not going to save him, that he could only be saved through the Spirit, through receiving the Spirit that cries, Abba, Father, just like Jesus did. Man, anthropos, again, man, that means all of us, so let's not blur it with questions about inclusive language. It is already inclusive, anthropos. It's meant to mean all of us, all each human being, and each human being in Christ. How we are saved, how we are saved by becoming one with Christ. And he talks about faith, but what is interesting here is that we learn a lot about the importance of baptism. He gives us probably the earliest account of the Eucharist, and we get to see the importance of the Sunday Eucharist for ourselves. It doesn't unpack it as much as we would like, but we have enough to see the traditio, to see the tradition, and what he passes down and wants to pass on to the next generation. And for Catholics in particular, that means the Sunday Eucharist and its centrality to who we are, how we worship God, how we are close to the living Lord. So, big picture stuff about the letters. We have 13 or maybe 14. We might actually have more than that. What do I mean by that? We have 13 letters officially, okay? And then there's Hebrews. And there are those who still believe that Hebrews was written by Paul, or written under his inspiration, or was written using his theology. And it would seem that at the moment scholars aren't very sure that it belongs to Paul at all. And so when we read from it, we say a reading from the letter to the Hebrews. We don't attribute it to Paul. And that may change. Well, we might find something under a stone at the top of this walk one day, and then we'll all go, right enough, it was St. Paul. But at the moment, we're just not attributing it to him, but it's a relation, it's a cousin, okay? It's a wonderful letter. One of my friends in Rome, who still works for the Pope, it's his favourite letter of St. Paul. And he loves this time of the year when we start to look at it in the officer readings, in the Liturgy of the Hours. I don't know how many of you like to look at the Liturgy of the Hours. We just started, it was Sunday, wasn't it? And he loves this because you are diving off the high dale into very deep blue theological water. And I'm not sure that I'm really, I like it slightly differently. But this Palermine, this Monsignore, he thinks it's wonderful. And we would have lovely long conversations and I would get completely lost. But Hebrews is there. It's sort of part of the Pauline corpus, but we're not sure just quite how. So then you've got a few of his letters that were written apparently in captivity, but there are slight wee things that make those who are very bright on the subject think that they weren't all necessarily written from Rome, because remember he was a captive, even as he would have been dragged across the Mediterranean, so he could have written them from some other places. And then there's the question of the composition, just so that you can see it. So did he write them? Did he dictate them? Did he just dictate the sense and let the person fill in? Or did they just say, just put my name to that? So where's Sister Miriam? So she does this for me from time to time. Where are you, Sister? So Sister is she's my secretary, and she knows how I like to write things. And her English is brilliant. Okay, so I might say, right, okay, just write in a nice thank you. And Sister will draft something and I'll go, perfect. Or I'll say, I've sent it back to you, Sister, with a few tweaks. And I sign it. So there are ways and ways of writing letters to this day, even with the internet. And when it comes to St. Paul, well, he might have used a bit of all of these things, and we don't really know. So there's a lot of fun guesswork, very intelligent, very studious guesswork about which of these he uses depending on which letter we're looking at. And I trust them. I'm sure they know what they're talking about. And he mixes very concrete, specific issues with very deep, very high theology. That's fairly obvious, I'm sure you can see that. And we're just going to look at one or two of these things. So Philippi, quick look at Philippi. It's a wee town in what is now Turkey, and founded by Philip of Macedon. That was Alexander the Great's dad. Yeah, okay. Mark Antony beats Brutus and Cassius there in a double battle. How cool is that? Yeah. Military Roman colony founded after Actium. Okay, I found that. I didn't know that. I didn't know any of these things about Philippi. And the church that founded Paul's second missionary journey about 50 AD. Great. Again, I've lived most of my life without knowing that, but there it is. It could be important to you in a tight spot at some point. Probably should. Letter written around 61 to 63 AD from house arrest somewhere. I always thought it was Rome, but Rome is not the only place apparently that he wrote letters while under guard. So this letter to the Philippians, these guys in Philippi, the church there was founded in Paul's second missionary journey, okay. Written by Paul around 61, 63 during his arrest in Rome, or while he was in Ephesus. And very smart people, smarter than I, have got reasons for suggesting that it doesn't need to concern us here. Okay? And this is interesting. And I don't like it when they do this, but anyway, I'm telling you. So it could be 2 or 3 letters that have all been rolled into one, or one conflated letter. And I put in Polycarp here. Polycarp is someone who is just a step away from St. John the Apostle, and therefore from the living Lord. And we have letters from Polycarp, beautiful things, that we know where they had a bit of this and a bit of that, and they found a way to keep them by putting them together, which was practical and saved money and saved time. And there are scholars who suggest that Philippians, this is just academic, so you don't need to worry about it, may be 3 letters that have been put together. And smart people have done it that way. They think This is just to let you see that it's possible. It's not impossible. It's not utterly impossible. It may have happened this way, that there were different letters to the Philippians that have been put together in this way. Again, I'm not going to worry about it too much, or make you worry about it too much. If it's true, if they're onto something, then we're looking at letter B, and it's got these bits and pieces. It starts off with thanksgiving and prayer, news about Paul's condition, and then the bit in bold is what we're going to take a quick look at, okay? And then news about Timothy and Epaphroditus, and fine and dandy. But this instruction to the community is interesting. So he's appealing to them. He's appealing to them using categories that are fairly familiar to us, so that they be steadfast, that they live in harmony with one another, that they have humility, each of them, and that they are obedient and selfless. You can see how these things are important to build and maintain a sense of community. But this is the bit we're really interested in, is this humility and obedience, because yes, I've done it this way, I forgot. So steadfastness, what is he getting into in the first part there in chapter 1? That they are citizens. So citizens is important, but he uses citizen in a way that isn't just about being a good citizen out there. It's about being a good citizen with a view to paradise. And that means being good citizens to each other, as if we were the city of God, as if we were the New Jerusalem. You can hear that interesting way of using citizen. That we be worthy of the gospel of Christ. You can see him using gospel in that particular way. He's not talking about a couple of manuscripts called gospels. He's talking about the good news of Christ. That we stand firm like soldiers. He uses language, military language, for standing firm and alert and ready and disciplined at their post, and with one purpose, so that we are all of one mind and heart, united with each other, which is important too. So that is all under the heading of steadfastness. Harmony, well, I like harmony. I think that's a wonderful thing, which is, if we want union with Christ, of course we do, but union with Christ, if it means anything, it is an encouragement and an incentive for how we live our life with each other, again, as Christians set slightly apart, as citizens together of the New Jerusalem. That's harmony. Humility, something that's really, really beautiful, very fine. So I've written here, do not act for selfish ends. Erithia, which is self-seeking, which is a kind of, it's just for me. I'm the only one that's important, the rest of you can drop dead. Petty jealousies, they just don't matter. I can hear him saying that. Get over yourself a little bit. That humility is so much more important, it's so much healthier, so much more Christ-like. And selflessness and concern, that's for other people and not just about you. Don't make it just about you. And imitate Christ in his humility, and you can see where this is going to be going shortly. And then obedience and selflessness, okay. So imitating Christ's own obedience and selflessness, fine. Pride versus fear and trembling, but fear in that biblical sense, that's in there too. Work out your salvation, that's interesting, the way that he talks about working for it. There seems to be, at least in some voices that come from the Reformation, that Catholics are too busy working for their salvation. But it is something that we do have from a very, very long time ago. That we're not just saved or not saved. We have an effort to make. Work out your own salvation. Work for it. It depends on you. And how does it depend on you? It depends on the way that you behave, your moral conduct. It's fairly obvious, but he does say it. And to help, God is already at work in you. Grace is already at work within you. So you're not on your Todd when you're doing this, but it's still over to you to make an effort. You can't just sit back and just be filled with God's grace and go to heaven. You have to make an effort of some kind. And this is interesting, he makes a comment about blameworthy children of God versus blameless Christian children of God, that you can be a child of God, that God can create children for himself from these very stones. We can hear our Lord saying that. And there's an element of that here too. You can be a child of God, but it's not going to do you any good. You have to be a worthy child of God. And as a Christian, you ought to be a worthy child of God. And then he mentions the day of Christ, the end of all things, when the judge of the world and the Lord of all joins us, the parousia at the end of time. He gets into that. But I don't want to spend a lot of time there. This is the bit that I was sent to speak to you about. So it's an insert, the thing in front of you. It's a hymn. I don't know if you were aware of that or not. And it's Jewish Christian, so it's got Jewish elements, Christian elements, and it's been inserted, and it can be seen fairly obviously from the text, from its shape, from the language that's there. But it's a key text. For me, I didn't write this idly. It is fundamental in Christianity, this text, and that's why we listen to it. Things like Palm Sunday and Holy Week and so on, because it tells us something so important and so central in why Jesus died on the cross. Why did Jesus have to die on the cross? And how did he die on the cross? And this hymn, this is already a hymn that exists before Paul writes this letter. So that means it was only about 20 years old. They had come up with this hymn. And we've had it ever since. And thanks to it being preserved in this text, to imagine that they already had developed this thinking and that Paul was able to share it with them in wherever it came from. I don't know where it came from exactly, but it's in Greek, it's got Jewish and Christian elements in it, and it is telling us something so important to our understanding of who Jesus is and what he came to do and how he did it. For me, it's a key text. If we lost an awful lot, of the Bible, all of a sudden, this is one of these things you would not want to lose sight of, because it tells us so much about him. What else have we got here? It's been placed, this text that you've got there, between a call to humility and one to obedience and selflessness. So it is trying to amplify or underline these things that he's calling the community to do. It is centred on Christ, but this is interesting, on the real historic Jesus who actually died on the cross. And even that was being challenged by the end of the century. People said, oh well, he was dying, but he hadn't died. And then the spices revived him in the tomb, and then he married Mary Magdalene, or whatever it is you want to. There's all sorts of great Dan Brown stuff goes off in all sorts of directions. But this is about Jesus dying horribly in public, naked, tortured to death on that cross. That's what this is about. It's about the reality. And it's a very early charismatic, very early confession of the faith. That's evident. It's recognisable as a hymn by its rhythm, but not only that, we have this thing, kinon, which is kenosis, the word empty or too empty, and it's un-Pauline. This is interesting. So Paul didn't write this hymn; he got this from somewhere else. But this language sets it apart, and this is at the centre of it, as you will see. And apparently, he does add a line, and I didn't know this. Even death on a cross, you'll see it there in the middle. That he puts that in this Thanato de Stavro, which it's interesting that we'll look at it in a minute. That's why I've given it to you. Things to look out for. His divine status, you'll find it there. So he was in the form of God, which is an odd way to talk about it. We don't use that language anymore. We say that he is true God and true man. That is a formulation that comes to us through the creeds that had to be worked out, as there was a great dispute about whether or not Jesus was God and Jesus was man. And we say that he's both, he's true God and true man. The language that Paul prefers to use is that he was in the form of God, because he's making a point about Jesus' equality with God. And this is interesting, the miser's booty thing that we're going to come to. It's that he didn't. I'm not going to unpack this just yet, and I'm going to leave it for a minute. You see the second line? Who, though of divine status, did not treat like a miser's booty his right to be like God. So you can imagine him sort of holding on to this and not giving it to anybody else. This idea. It's a very odd idea. It looks a bit more elegant in the other translations that we've got, but it's interesting that should be there. We'll come back to that. Kenosis, this is at the centre of this text once we get to read through it, that he emptied himself. So it tells us, it's, as I say here, a profoundly important theological theme. He's not only emptied of his divinity, but also of his rightful status of divine glory. He doesn't stop being God, but he gives up the right to be treated like God, as it were, so that he is put to death. Otherwise he couldn't be put to death. So he gives up his glory, and it's seen in the humiliation of just his incarnation. Just, first of all, just becoming one of us. That's already a kenosis. That's already a humiliation. And to take on the form of a slave suggests, as I was just saying there, that it's not an intrinsic constitution, but the condition of a slave, that he doesn't stop being God, but that he takes on something else, the condition of a slave. And it's not, there are two words we use for slave. We use doulos, we use diakonos, and one of them gives us deacons. But a doulos is a real slave, a slave that you kick around, and that you can put to death, and you can treat as your property. And that is the word we use for Christ here. And it says here, he who freely made himself a slave becomes Lord, becomes kurios, and there is a radical transformation there. Double humiliation in becoming a man like us, but also in suffering the cross. Number one, he becomes one of us, not only a man, but like us all, without any privilege, any particular privilege at all. And secondly, not only the humiliation of just being like us, but also, it says, he humbled himself further with an obedience that means death, and even death on the cross, his words. And so it appears to be at the furthest. Can you imagine? You've got God's glory, it's so impossibly above us all, it's so impossibly perfect and complete. And what happens to Jesus is the furthest you can get from that. That's what he's trying to tell us. And that his obedience was not only that of a doulos, but that it was heroic, what he did. That it was only a hero could do that, and therefore God exalts him to the loftiest heights. But the word that is used for it is a way of saying uber exalted, super exalted. You can't get more exalted than this, in the way that he says it. And he receives, as a result of that, this in superabundant contrast to the kenosis, he receives a new status, and he receives a title. And that is the title that we're talking about. That it's the name of God. He puts the name of God and the name of Jesus as equivalent to each other. And that's interesting. That's very interesting. And so it means, therefore, that everyone everywhere in the whole universe should bend the knee and proclaim to the glory of God the Father that Jesus Christ is Lord, L-O-R-D. That's Anglo-Saxon, but it's kurios here, but the equivalent behind it is, these are all substitutes for the sacred name of God in the Old Testament that is unpronounceable, or not to be pronounced, because it's so holy. So it's a wonderful way of letting you see how low Jesus went, not only becoming like you and me, but ending up on the cross the way he did, and dying on the cross the way he did, and how that becomes, in contrast, the opportunity for God to raise him on high, give him the name which is above all names. But Jesus is there, Lord is there, Christ is there, and it's the equivalent of the sacred name of God himself. He is equal to God. He is God. As he says elsewhere, this is Paul, back to Paul, he says, Christ died and lived again, that he might be Lord of both heaven and earth, and we see that in a few places. And we get to see Paul's thinking, which is big picture thinking, that this has cosmic consequences, this has universe consequences, because this is about all time and all places. It's very bold, it's very big, but if the man who asserts that there was a big bang to start the universe happens to be a Catholic priest, and who can think of these two things at the same time, Georges Lemaitre, I think that's pretty impressive. Because Georges Lemaitre, who was a correspondent with Einstein, you probably know all that story, he also could see the big picture, where Jesus Christ is Lord of the universe, Lord of all things as well, including the Big Bang. So, the points I wanted to make, basically, that kenosis, that wonderful word, and so you can't preach now, Bobby, they've heard all this.
What's my sermon for
You'll have to think of something else to say. Well, I suppose the rest of them haven't heard it. Kenosis points to Christ's true divinity and true humanity. That's in the language that we use nowadays. Okay? But by it, St. Paul also teaches us the following. As a community, to be worthy citizens of heaven. As individuals, to imitate Christ's own loving, willing, conscious humility. From all eternity, in the incarnation, in Christ's terrible suffering and death, in his super exalted uber glory, and in the power of his name, that he is equal, identical to God's own holiness, to God's own holy name. And I think that's just about all I had to say. So, and he says to us, be steadfast, humble, obedient, selfless. That's his message. That's Paul's message to you, to the Christians of Philippi, that he wants you to hear above and beyond all that we've heard. He's trying gently to encourage them to do those things, to be steadfast, humble, obedient, and selfless. And says, complete my joy by having the same love for each other. Thanks very much. That's good.